In this video, we're going to set up autoscaling for EC2 instances using our AWS dashboard. So, as always, let's click on Services, and then EC2 here at the top. And by the way, this would be a great video for you to follow along with in your own dashboard. Now, there are 4 different pieces here we're going to use on the EC2 dashboard in order to set this up. And the first is launch configurations here under autoscaling. So launch configurations are templates that an autoscaling group uses to launch EC2 instances. When you create a launch configuration, you specify information for the instances such as the ID of the AMI or Amazon Machine Image, the instance type, a key pair, 1 or more security groups, and a block device mapping. If you've launched an EC2 instance before, then you've already followed the process to launch an instance. So let's get started with launch configurations by clicking Launch Configuration here on the left side of the page. And when you hit the Create Launch Configuration button here at the top, you'll notice right off the bat that this page looks really familiar, and that's because you have been here before. So creating a launch configuration looks exactly like creating an EC2 instance. The only difference is you're not going to be creating an actual EC2 instance here. You're only creating the configuration that we can use to automatically spin up instances for our autoscaling group later on. So because you're already pretty familiar with this part, let's kind of speed through it a little bit. I'm going to select Linux or Amazon Linux 2 AMI here. And I'm going to leave this on the default free tier eligible instance. For the name, I don't really care too much. And we're going to keep going. Default storage is fine. And then because we're just going to tear these instances down as soon as we're done with them, let's just use the default security group here and not do anything else to it. We don't need to review, so let's hit Create Launch Configuration button here at the bottom right. It's going to ask us for a key pair, so I'm going to choose one that I've already created and hit Create Launch Configuration. And once again, it didn't start to create an EC2 instance. All we've done is create a launch configuration for later use. Now, the next thing we do after we've created a launch configuration is create an autoscaling group. So an autoscaling group contains a collection of EC2 instances that share similar characteristics and are treated as a logical grouping for the purposes of instance scaling and management. For example, if a single application operates across multiple instances, you might want to increase the number of instances in that group to improve the performance of the application, or decrease the number of instances to reduce costs when demand is low. So after you've created a launch configuration, you do have the option of just hitting this button to continue to autoscaling group creation, but just for practice, let's close out and then let's practice finding autoscaling groups in the EC2 dashboard. So on the left side of the page, under autoscaling, you'll find it right here, autoscaling groups, and let's hit Create Autoscaling Group. Now, as of 2018, you have 2 different options here. You have launch configuration, which is a default, but you also have a newer launch template option. The coolest thing about launch template is that you can include versioning into it if you need versioning for your launch configurations. But for now, let's just stick with the default launch configuration. For the second step here, we do have the option to either create a new launch configuration or use an existing one, but we just created ours, so let's go ahead and use that one. So I'm going to select that and hit Next Step here. So now we've chosen our launch configuration. So for the autoscaling group name, doesn't really matter here. I'm going to choose example autoscaling group. For the group size, I want to start with 2 instances. And then once again, the only VPC we have in our region right now is the default VPC, so we'll leave it there. And for the subnet, doesn't matter which one you choose, just choose any subnet here. And you know what, let's go ahead and choose 2 subnets, and what that'll do is our autoscaling group will make sure to deploy uniformly across more than 1 subnet. And that's one of the greatest things about autoscaling is the high availability and fault tolerance that you get from being able to scale into multiple subnets here. And we're not going to mess with advanced details, but for your own reference, you do have a few other pieces of configuration here. So load balancing, if you want, you can choose to receive traffic from 1 or more load balancers. We haven't created one yet. We're going to do that just a little bit later in this video, so we're going to leave this unchecked for now. The health check grace period is how long you can give an EC2 instance in a state of unhealthiness before it'll decide to scale up based on that. So we're going to leave it at the default 300 seconds or 5 minutes. Instance protection. So instance protection, if you have this scale in set, then newly launched instances will be protected from scale-in by default. So autoscaling is not going to terminate newly minted instances during scale-in. Anyway, let's leave everything default there and hit Next, Configure Scaling Policies. So on the next page here, we have the auto-scaling group policy, and we have two options here. We can keep the group at its initial size, which I'll remind you was 2, or we can use scaling policies to adjust the capacity of this group. And I do want to talk about this just a little bit. So when you enable this option, it's going to start with the default that you chose earlier in the configuration. So scale between 2 and 2. Let's change this to scale between 2 and 3. And then we have a couple of options on how we want to make that scale up or down. So the first option we have here for scaling the group size is the simplest option. So you have a metric type and you only have a few to choose from. We're going to leave it on the average CPU utilization here, and then the target value. What this means is if I were to enter 75 in here, then anytime our instances hit an average of 75% or more CPU utilization for a certain amount of time, it's going to decide to scale up to 3 instances. And then the reverse, if it goes down below 75 for too long, it's going to scale right back down again. That being said, we do have the option to set scaling policies instead. Now, the reason you might want to use this option is if you need more control than just setting one basic alarm. So we have an increase group size option and a decrease group size option. So let's configure one for each. The name we're going to leave as the default, and execute policy when. Let's create a new alarm here. Now the first thing you'll notice is you have the option to send a notification to an SNS topic. SNS topics are a great way to get notifications out to a number of different destinations, and we are going to cover that later in the course, but for now, let's just go ahead and disable this. And the next thing you'll notice is that you do have a lot more configuration options when it comes to how to scale up. So let's choose whenever the average of CPU utilization is equal to or greater than 75%. For at least one consecutive period of 15 minutes. And we'll give it the default name here and create the alarm. So again, what that means is anytime CPU utilization hits an average of at least 75% for 900 seconds or 15 minutes, then it's going to add one instance. And then wait the default 300 seconds or 5 minutes before allowing another scaling activity. And we can do the exact same thing for decrease group size. So let's click on here. Let's go ahead and disable the SNS topic for now. And then let's say whenever the average of CPU utilization is less than or equal to 50% for one consecutive period of 15 minutes, we'll give it the default name and create alarm. So once again, what that means is anytime your total CPU utilization is at less than or equal to 50%, for 15 minutes, then it's going to remove however many instances you decide here. So we'll say remove one instance. And we're good there, so let's hit Next, Configure Notifications. And once again, for notifications here, it's going to use the AWS service called SNS, or Simple Notification Service. If you were to add a notification, then you have a couple of options here. You can either manually create an SNS topic right here, or if you have any topics created, then you can use those. Now again, we are going to get into SNS in more detail later in the course, so for now, we're just going to skip this one and move on to Configure Tags. Now, just for organization, I like to give everything at least a name tag, so I'm going to do that now. Example Autoscaling Group, and hit Review. And then on this page, we just hit Create Autoscaling Group. Now this will take just a moment, so I'm going to pause the video for a brief period here. And there we have it. Our auto-scaling group has been created successfully. And one of the cool things about auto-scaling groups is it will immediately scale up to the minimum amount of instances that you've configured. So because we set our auto-scaling group to have at least 2 instances at all times, then if we were to go to Instances and then click on there, you'll see that we do have 2 instances with example auto-scaling group that are initializing now, which means that auto-scaling group is almost ready to use. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and find load balancing on the left side of the page and click on target groups to start the next part of this process. And put simply, target groups are the middleman between the load balancer that we're going to create last in this video and the auto-scaling group that we just created. So target groups are a way to route traffic from load balancers to the instances in the auto-scaling group that we just configured. Now let's start that process by clicking Create Target Group. And on the first module here, you'll be able to decide a couple of things. And the first is how target groups are going to route traffic to their instances. So first of all, let's choose a name here. I'm going to go with example target group. Now the protocol, you can choose between HTTP and HTTPS and TCP. And the protocol is just the protocol the load balancer uses when routing traffic to targets in the group. We're going to leave that at HTTP. Same thing for port, we're going to choose port 80. And then for the target type, that's whether targets are registered using instance IDs or private IP addresses. We're going to leave it on instance ID to keep everything simple. And then for VPC, once again, it's a drop-down of any VPCs in this region. And because we've created everything else in the default VPC, and in fact that's the only one we have, we're just going to leave it there. Health check settings are the settings you want to use for the target group to check the health of its instances. So for protocol, you've got your choice between just two, HTTP and HTTPS. And then for path, if you have a specific web path that you're configuring for a web application on your instance, then you can override this path to find the actual health of your web application inside the instance. So that's what you would use to override that option there. And then finally, you also have advanced health check settings. So if you needed to override the port that you wanted to check, or if you want to change the healthy threshold and the unhealthy threshold, which are the number of consecutive attempts your target group will make on an instance before determining that it's either healthy or unhealthy, then you can change it there. You also have your timeout option, which is the amount of time in seconds during which no response means a failed health check, and then your interval, which is the approximate amount of time between health checks of an individual target. You have a minimum of 5 seconds here and a maximum of 5 minutes or 300 seconds. And then finally, we are going to leave it on the default success code, which means if we get 200 for the code, then our target group is going to consider that a success. So let's hit create here. Oh, left it on there. And let's just disable the advanced settings and hit create. And there we go. We have a target group. So the very last step here is going to be our load balancer. And finally, we have your load balancer. And your load balancer, again, is going to be what takes your internet end users' traffic and routes it to the auto-scaling group and the instances in there through your target group. So let's hit Create Load Balancer to get started. Now you have 3 options here as to which load balancer type you want to use. The classic load balancer, you're probably never going to use. It's only for applications running in the EC2 classic network, which you're never going to find yourself using. So for the scope of this certification, we're mostly going to stick with the application load balancer here. If you need a lot of high performance and if you have static IP addresses for your application, and if you want to operate at the connection level, then you can choose Network Load Balancer. But once again, for the scope of the Certified Developer, we're going to stick with Application Balancer here. And this is what you're going to choose when you need just a flexible feature set for your web application with either HTTP or HTTP secure traffic. So let's hit Create here. So for the first page here, let's set our name. Just example load balancer. And then for the scheme, you have 2 options. So you have internet facing, which is a load balancer that routes requests from clients over the internet, and then internal, which routes requests using private IP addresses. We're going to leave it internet facing here. And then you can choose IPv4 or dual stack. We're going to leave it on IPv4. And then for the listener, that means you can choose whether you're going to listen on port 80 for your load balancer or port 443. So we're going to leave it on the default here because we're not actually setting up a web application. For the availability zones, if you recall, in an earlier part of this video, we used the subnets in US East 1A and US East 1B. So for uniformity, let's leave it there. You can also set tags if you'd like. I'm just going to skip it for now and go to security settings here. And if you're not using HTTPS protocol, then you're going to get this error, and it'll give you the option to set that up here, but we're going to skip that and go to security groups. We'll just leave it with the default security group for now and go to routing. Now here is where we're finally going to start routing traffic from our load balancer to a target group. So for target group, you have two options. You can either create a new one, or you can use our existing one that we created earlier. Note that each target group can only be associated with one load balancer. So if we had already associated this target group, it wouldn't show up in the dropdown here. For protocol, port, and target type, we actually set those earlier, so you don't have the option of changing them here. And then for advanced health check settings, we set these in the target group, so you can't change these either. Everything's set already for us. So let's register targets. Right now it shows no registered targets, so let's just get the load balancer created and then we can see what's up. So next review, just a quick review of all of our details, and let's hit create. And there you go, we've successfully created our load balancer. Let's close that out. And there we go, our first load balancer. So let's click on the Listeners tab here. And what we're looking at here is that the load balancer listens on port 80 and forwards its traffic to the example target group. So let's click on the example target group here. The very last thing we have to do in this video is register targets with the target group so that the target group knows where to send the traffic from the load balancer. And we'll do that on the Targets tab by hitting Edit. And you'll see that we have a list of our eligible targets, and two of those are the targets that got spun up with the Autoscaling group. So let's select those, hit Add to Register, and save. And that'll take just a bit of time for those instances to completely register with the target group, but we're not going to wait for that anyway because we haven't set up a web application, so there's nothing to view in the browser. Instead, let's go over very quickly what we did in this video. So first, we created a launch configuration, which is just a configuration that we can use to automatically spin up servers with preset configuration. Next, we created an autoscaling group, which is a group with rules on how to scale out and in on the number of servers it manages based on certain conditions. Next, we created a target group for the load balancer to send traffic to. After that, we created the actual load balancer, which listens for traffic over the internet and routes that traffic to our target group. And then finally, we registered targets with the target group. And those targets were instances that were created automatically using the autoscaling group policy. And that about wraps it up for this video, so if it all makes sense, feel free to move on.